unofficial job is to communicate what we're doing to other places, open the door and show other folks what we've been up to.
City council candidates and mayoral candidates have promised, in my first year, there were going to be 1,000 tiny homes built. And it never happens.
Right before it looked like it was about to explode, we kind of diffused it with our goal is to get sewer in here. How do you think we should be able to do that? How can we work within your constrictions of this space? And that led into, well, we could put this sewer above the ground. We could build a deck and a shower on top of it. And we could glue everything to the walls and never screw or nail. And it just turned this, it seemed like a hazmat situation that was sealed into the concrete into, wow, this can be the most awesome community kitchen, bathroom, laundry room, meeting space at a tiny house village for vulnerable women that we've ever had.
My name is Lisa Gustaveson. I am a strategic advisor for the City of Seattle's Human Services Department, the Homeless Strategy and Investment Division. And my role in the Seattle Tiny House Village project started in 2017. I was an evaluator for the original program and sort of stayed on to be the main planner on the project for the past coming up on 4 years. Human Services Department has been the main city department that's been involved in addition to the Department of Neighborhoods. So we hold the contract and we hold all of the historical and all the planning and strategy and funding around our involvement in the villages.
My name is Brad Gerber. I work with the Low Income Housing Institute. My title is Special Projects Manager. Which, since I've been at LIHI, looks like many different things. Special projects are all over the place. So my role started actually more on a community organizing side, working with folks that were in tent cities and some of the first tiny house villages that opened in Seattle, back when there were just a few of them, and when it was, as Janis and Lisa described, more of a tent cities program. And as it's shifted into tiny house villages, and as its role in kind of the urban landscape has changed, I've done project management, so leading the development of tiny house villages, working with volunteers, working with folks in building industries, contracting, doing some of the kind of partnership and engagement work towards getting new villages opened. And my role has, outside of just Seattle's tiny house program, also been to do some lead development work on tiny house villages in Tacoma, Olympia, and other places. LIHI's history dates about 30 years as an affordable housing developer, operator, owner, and a supportive services provider. So we are much bigger than our tiny house villages. We have actually large multifamily buildings with as many as 250 units right in the downtown area and historic buildings, scattered site housing for singles, couples, or folks fleeing domestic violence or homeless youth. We also have urban rest stops. We are a fairly large housing organization, 65 properties in 6 different counties around the Puget Sound. And the number of units is about 2,400. That has a lot of experience in this, and tiny houses are just one of the more recent ways that our organization has found ourselves of service in the community. So we try to support other cities and groups that want to do this kind of work as much as we can and keep ourselves pretty open source. So I end up doing some kind of casual technical assistance for other cities.
Janis, Traven, right now I'm with the Magnolia Community Council. At the time that I started with what was then Tent City, the same group that is now in tiny homes, stayed involved with the group through the Magnolia Community Council. And when the first organization, the tent cities, were set up, the city ordinance included a community advisory committee. And what Lisa hasn't shared with you is that she was on that committee as a Magnolia neighbor and a representative from Seattle University. I remain on the advisory committee.
So Magnolia is a neighborhood in northwest Seattle, and
correct,
has one of the 12 tiny home villages.
Yes.
Advisory council, how often do they meet?
Once a month.
What's the size of this? How many people are on it? And is it just all neighbors?
The city stipulates there is a number. at the outset, when it was tent city, there was some consideration given to having someone from this community, somebody from the community, somebody from the faith community, somebody from academia.
Pastor Lawrence R. Willis, pastor the True Vine of Holiness Missionary Baptist Church, also president of the United Black Clergy, and I'm the community liaison for the Urban League, working with tiny houses and villages, and our church sponsors 2 tiny house villages, True Hope Village and Othello Village. We've been sponsoring Othello Village for over 4 years, and we opened up True Hope as well. Also, we build tiny houses with my nonprofit Love to. My church, True Vine, sponsors True Hope with New Hope. So that's why it's called True Hope, True Vine and New Hope. So it's True Hope. And volunteers throughout the community that work with us with giving toiletries and food. And so we're working with a couple organizations with feeding on Saturdays. And I sit on LIHI's board. We're at now, because we're doing everything on Facebook, at our capacity in the church, we're around 150, 200.
So right now, the city of Seattle is funding 294 units of tiny house village units across the city in 8 projects. Mm-hmm. This year, our city council approved adding 3 new villages to the city. So the next step is that we will begin to work with agencies to implement those. In the city of Seattle, through the history of this program, we've had 4 villages at City of Seattle property sites, 6 if we count 2 that moved, 1 at the Port of Seattle, 2 at religiously sponsored sites, and 1 at privately sponsored. In perspective, the villages are 11% of our overall, the number of units. So we have just over 2,700 units of emergency response beds or units in the city. 18% of what we call basic, which is, you can come in and stay overnight, and that's just almost 500 of the beds that are considered basic, that don't have a lot of resources. 54% or just over 1,400 are what we consider enhanced, which are 24/7. Folks can come in, stay, leave their belongings, bring their pets, stay with their partners, have enhanced services to help them really move out of homelessness. And then the villages are 294, so just about 11% that are that the villages contain. And then we also have transitional housing, which is folks can, mostly families can stay up to 2 years and really get intensive services to help.
Tiny houses themselves have been, that program has existed in its current iteration for about 5 years in Seattle, although it does extend from decades of organizing by self-managed encampments and tent cities that have been building some of the political precedent for this type of program. Really decades, but in the more contemporary history, years, tent cities in a very organized fashion with their own kind of management plan have existed long predating this program. And historically, Nicholsville and Cher, those groups had to move every 3 months. And so temporary stay, setting up and leaving, making community agreements and kind of covenants with hosts, that's not something that this program started, but we kind of picked up on that precedent. And as you mentioned, Charly, not an institutionalization, but really actually recognition of that kind of process, recognition of, okay, well, let's change it from 3 months to 2 years. Let's actually formalize the community engagement that is going on and create a stakeholder group for both accountability and support. Let's actually bring in fiscal sponsorship, and let's bring in services. It's not like where in other cities they're setting up sanctioned encampments at the same location that a previously unsanctioned encampment was. So it wasn't a form of outreach, although maybe Lisa can speak to whether that has happened, which in the instance of Myers Way, it did kind of happen that way. And it may be a model that is successful, because I do think that there's some success around the country with that type of work, where there's this combination of both outreach with an existing encampment group that have kind of found a space that is, that they're kind of like either claiming or where they're just being to stay safe in community, with services, with infrastructure, with facilities.
I think you got it, Brad. Couldn't have said it better.
Well, it's great to point out that there's already this kind of like cultural infrastructure.
So the city of Seattle was the first in the country to offer public land and funding to support permitted encampments, tent encampments. So in late 2014, there was an emergency task force on unsheltered homelessness, and they recommended that the city permit these organized encampments on public land or privately owned property. In early 2015, the City Council adopted an ordinance related to land use and zoning for interim use, and that included requirements for community outreach, operational standards, and public health requirements. It also required that there be a project service agreement put in place that included contracted service commitments and was a line item reimbursement for the public funding to be tracked. It also, what's interesting is that it combined this self-managed model with a case management model to focus not only on keeping people safe, but also to really help folks end their experience with homelessness and move into a permanent place to live. So the ordinance also gave us the ability to permit the villages or the encampments for 1 year with a 1-year renewal. And that's how we ended up with, as Janis was talking about, with the Interim Village, that after the 2 years, we needed to move it. So we also used a qualification review process to identify operators, and LIHI originally was was the fiscal agent for 2 of the self-managed groups in the city. That later evolved into LIHI becoming the operator as the model over the years evolved into an enhanced shelter model. The village units are recognized as HUD, as shelter beds, and they are now the contracted operator for all these years. So starting back in 2015 to 16, there were 3 tent encampments that were opened: the Ballard, the Interim, and Othello. And then in 2017, the city added the Georgetown Village, as well as the first harm reduction site, which was Licton Springs. And those 2 were opened with the tiny houses, like intentionally designed, and Brad can talk more about that, but they were intentionally designed to have tiny houses as the model, along with an hygiene trailer. There was another site that was added, Myers Way, that that was a self-managed encampment, and eventually that site also was transferred to all tiny houses. And in 2017, and if that wasn't enough, we also relocated the Interbay Village to the Port of Seattle property, and that went from being all tents to being tiny houses with hygiene. In 2018, we opened the True Hope Village, and we added 2 more harm reduction sites, one in Whittier, the story that Brad tells about our experience there, for the Whittier Women's Village, and Lake Union Village, or as we like to call it, Love. And in 2018, we relocated the Ballard encampment to a new site called North Lake. In 2019, we worked with the community to update the ordinance to remove the 2-year move requirement, which was really great, because then we didn't need to be thinking every 2 years that we had to relocate the villages. And then in 2020, we opened the TC Spirit Village. And in 2021, we'll see what that's going to bring.
And oh, that's great, and that's a great history. Thank you for that timeline. I'm curious on the so this ordinance passed for the city to permit using city land. Were there 3 properties at the time that that you guys had in mind?
There was work that was done that was identifying these city properties. So those properties were, I think everything happened concurrently. I don't think there was one thing happened before the other. So they were passing the original ordinance. And again, it was for these tent encampments that previously were moving around to religious spaces to say, hey, let's give city property so that these men have keeping around. That was the genesis of that ordinance. As the project became more tiny house focused, it became less easy or realistic to be moving these tiny houses every 2 years. We use a combination when it comes to property. We're not stuck in one particular way. We'll take whatever we can get, basically. Mm-hmm. And then Licton Springs was also owned by LIHI. As the city was talking about what was next, we were being petitioned by the community not to get rid of the village, but why are you taking it away from us? And that, for me, really solidified that these villages play an important role in our community. They're more than just a shelter program. They are part of, they bring people together, right? They open opportunities. I mean, Janis can probably talk about situations where people in the villages have got jobs through connections with people that they meet from the community. And
kind of remarkable about our Magnolia village is that the original city ordinance stipulated that it could be located for 1 year with a 1-year renewal. And it was set up as something of a promise to the neighborhood that you wouldn't be bothered for too long. For more than 2 years, we promise. The end of the 2 years, several of us who were on the advisory committee or had worked with, had just gotten to know a number of the, I guess we called them campers then instead of residents. We started advocating with the city to find that we understand that you say that you have to move them, but we want you to move them within Magnolia because we've developed all of these relationships. We have developed all resources. It would be dumb for the city to throw that away.
Communities like being educated in how to be compassionate, as opposed to just, understanding that some communities have built that capacity and have built that network and have that experience and are therefore safe and supportive places. It's just an interesting framework to hear from someone who's kind of doing community work and sees them as like an asset towards building that capacity. So I appreciate you calling that out.
Yeah, and that's because I'm looking back on just how that we had to pull True together with community meetings and how we got community involved. At one time, it seemed like it wasn't going to work out. People were opposing it. But now we see how the community has bought in and how community meetings and advisory committees are there.
These are dispersed across the city where you have Ballard in the north, Inner Bay sort of in the middle, and Othello on the southern part of town.
We've always looked for geographic parity through this whole process.
I love that, geographic parity. Why did it go from tents to cabins?
We were looking at a really, large number of people who are unsheltered. And so we wanted to quickly open up programs. And we knew that LIHI could open these programs, open the villages relatively fast. We had property available. And LIHI had already started to put some of the tiny houses onto the properties. And from what I remember, it was, we're gonna take some of the tents and make them tiny houses. Are you okay with that? And the city said, sure, as long as it doesn't negatively impact anything, go ahead. And it was sort of a natural transition or logical transition from tent to tiny house. Yeah, there's been numerous over the years litigation around from a public health perspective, also from a land use perspective
Concern
around the
trolling.
concerns. Yeah, yep. But we've worked in each case with our city attorney's office as well as with the community to address any of those concerns. I think that's why it's important that all of the villages, they're visited regularly through public health. We hold the agency accountable through their contract to a standard of service and such. So you're right, Janis. So there's been numerous.
And I'd love to just jump in too. So just also to look at that history. So some of those first sites that did open, the site that was in Ballard, for example, in discussion with some folks at the permitting office in Seattle, we were actually not pointed in a direction, but sort of shown a direction, which was that if you stay under 120 square feet with a built structure, which is in the International Building Code, then you don't need a construction permit. You don't need engineering drawings. You don't need architectural drawings, as long as you're building it in a safe way per public health and fire department standards. So there was some precedent for these structures, but just really fast forwarding back to this time, the city and really the community wasn't investing financially in these programs. It was still a quote unquote bare bones program. It was supporting an encampment that had been there for a very long time, that had a lot of community support with a legal space to be, with case management and with operating funds. But the structures weren't necessarily part of that vision. That had to come from grassroots organizing. It came from some of the students and partnerships like Reverend Willis's, where people were kind of putting in their expertise to build structures for their homeless neighbors. We did a village actually in 2015 at the Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd. So that was right in the central area as well. And it was 14 tiny houses. And it was the first time that we did a village exclusively with tiny houses that had plumbing in a central area, that had a kitchen with showers and toilets. So that was kind of the pilot project. It was the first time. All of those houses were built by students. They were built by pre-apprentices. They were in large part donated by the community. And the village was run for years without financial support from the city. And that was like this kind of proof of concept, which I think started that paradigm shift. And when Georgetown and some of these other villages opened and we knew, let's do all tiny houses, it was because we had been working with community members that were staying in tents and that were staying in tiny houses. And there was a very notable difference. The experience was dramatically different. With tiny houses that had power, all of a sudden, providing shelter space for families with children in an emergency situation, we could do. It was a possibility. People could stay and they could plug in a CPAP machine, right? There was just a huge elevation in experience and in safety for people. And I think that's something that the residents of these programs attested to, and we kind of followed their guidance as we were doing these villages. So it's not, if we go on, Housing Innovation Collaborative or even other web pages, there's this sense of like, check out this new, very fully thought idea. Like, look at this, not necessarily silver bullet, but we've thought of everything. Here's this full program and let's just kind of plug and play this village in. That's not at all how it's been in Seattle. This was like grassroots, grown as it's gone on. At no point in time, there have been like efforts toward rebranding, but at no point in time in Seattle in particular, was it ever like, check out this brand new idea. There was always precedent that was built from next to nothing. There was always precedent in management. There was precedent in community. There was precedent in structures. There was precedent in land use. So, we're really, this is innovative, of course, but it's more about bringing together all these other things that have already existed in some form, which I think is why it's so significant, right? Other cities are, they're dropping a brand new program that didn't grow from this kind of similar place. And we're really excited about that. And I think it's cool for us to have these threads to the past that we're kind of pulling on as we do new programs.
Othello Village might be one of the oldest ones, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And how we really got that going too through the pre-apprenticeship is that our students, I found college students from Seattle Central, South, and North were sleeping at bus stops and were sleeping, by the schools just to be able to go to school and have somewhere to sleep. They were, sleeping in cars and sleeping at the bus stop just to come to school. And I said, well, why not let's build some tiny houses that's close to the schools that students would be able to stay in and also go to school. That the traditional homeless type person had changed, and we've seen homeless people from Boeing, from losing their jobs to being in college, and so it kind of evolved into doing it for students as well in community.
I'd like to nominate Brad and Lisa in the next month, have a proposal for putting in a large tiny village or multiple tiny village communities at the Fort Lawton location.
What have the roadblocks been in growing this tiny home village program over the years?
I mean, definitely the ordinance was a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
For many years, the 2-year requirement. So once we sort of overcame that, that was one of the big roadblocks. Availability of property is a roadblock that, believe it or not, we don't have a ton of extra property, but we do have, opportunities. I think we've been pretty creative in thinking about how to use public and private property for this. And we really value LIHI's scrappy attitude of there's no bad idea that they're willing to put on the table, and we're willing to hear it around property opportunities. And then funding, consistent funding is probably a challenge, right? We have limited funding, so we have to every year build a budget for the city.
Funding transitional housing versus permanent housing, like how do you manage those dueling priorities?
Carefully, we have to build policies that keep multi-level constituents and needs, right? So
there are roadblocks within the city.
Our goal is to invest in programs that result in people exiting to permanent housing. That's our single-minded. So we're going to invest in programs that are exiting folks at a higher level of when somebody leaves, they're leaving to a permanent place versus leaving to another shelter or leaving out to the street, which is the worst case scenario.
But to really echo what Lisa said about this kind of both and situation, and just want to frame that construction of affordable housing can take 3 to 5 to 6 years. That's something that's worth remembering. We were just talking before this about another piece of property where there's been an intention of doing affordable housing for such a long time, and it's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of community input, it's a lot of design work, and it just takes an incredibly arduous road for the construction of affordable housing. So tiny house villages don't necessarily lack that kind of thoughtfulness or input, but it is a much faster approach to solving a need that once you wake up and realize that there's not enough housing, it's not just enough to tackle that alone, because you're still years away from the fruit of that tree.
It's not just either or, because oftentimes these sites become or can become affordable housing projects down the road. So it's sort of like you can do both, and they sort of address the same problem.
I would like one with City Light property. City Light, Seattle City Light. It took 6 months to get power hooked up. It took probably about 8 months to get plumbing hooked up at the port property where there's plumbing. Why?
The city of Seattle has been in the partners, really, the community has been trailblazing this. We've been doing this for the longest time, but we had to figure stuff out as we go. So literally for the plumbing, the reason we had a lien, is that what it was, Brad, on the property that we had to go across this property to get to where the plumbing was accessed.
I mean, like a task force level, here's how with tiny villages, here are the emergency code outline for installing a tiny village, so that you don't have to go through, 3-month wait to get an electrical inspection.
Well, there's the ordinance. The ordinance helps with that, but I think, Janis, the issue is that we have city code that is city code, right? So for electrical, the city, we would never have a special city code for electrical. If someone's doing an electrical permitting, they have a certain standard that they have to follow. I think what we have done, and this is, we don't talk about it really well, but we break down a lot of the issues. TC Spirit Village that we just opened was opened during COVID in Brad, how a month, maybe less?
It was like truly like first shovel on the ground to people moving in. It was about 5 weeks.
I mean, that's incredible. We broke down some serious stuff to get that to happen, while also staying within, because this is about safety. You know, a lot of these roadblocks are about safety. They're not about just making you know, things go fast. And so we really need to remember that. But yeah, TC Spirit, 5 weeks, that's pretty incredible.
There's a checklist that's called the State Environmental Protection Act, and it's a SEPA checklist, and it's something that takes many months to fulfill, and it's something that typically is not waived in any kind of housing emergency. So a lot of cities that we've worked with, they still have some of these SEPA requirements for sites, and it's a public process, and it's a process that is highly susceptible to litigation, to complaint, to community input, and it, while has good intentions at making sure that there are no environmental impacts that arise from a location, whether it's sound or air or emissions or other things, it sort of becomes an Achilles heel when you have community members, just individuals, right? One person, not in collaboration with anyone else, that says, I'm going to throw a whole bunch of money and I'm going to show up in court and I'm going to draw this thing out and I'm going to make it really expensive.
Just imagine NIMBY plus a litigious nature.
And when this lawsuit came out, it was basically put out that we either can't use this property at all, or we have to find a way to reduce the footprint from 18,000 square feet to 11,999. And that meant foregoing the portion of the property where there had been no infrastructure, electrical, houses added at all, and that we just have to make do with the part that we had already developed. We've been doing it for years, but there still is kind of some newness to these projects, right? There's never this embodied sense of we need to do something urgent and we need to do something that's going to really change the system. And so those council members, like Janis mentioned, they'll come out and make really big claims and want to change all of this work and not realize that our current housing and shelter system has been codified for decades, right? We're undoing this codification that has taken generations to build, and that is really exclusively, or for the most part, served the single family neighbors and our housed community that's looking for more control over their spaces. So how we break that paradigm down so that we can move quickly and be creative and actually get villages set up is I'd imagine many more years of work, but it is frustrating, and it does lead to nonprofits having to be scrappy at times at the expense of the people in the programs, and to, you know, us working within some of the same building codes where it's just like, you know, for God's sake, we have, you know, climate issue on top of COVID issue on top of housing issue, and we're still working with these building codes, but that is years in the unmaking that we have to work on, and every city's probably doing that. I also think it's unique that in Seattle, you know, I've seen certain communities add a village and be like, great, this is a village, but Seattle's reckoning is not with how to make one village happen. Seattle's reckoning is how do we like totally reimagine things, right? We're talking systems level. It's no longer village level. It's not like this one code, this one sewer, this one fence. We're building what is like an ecosystem of stratified shelter and housing solutions. And most cities aren't talking or thinking about that in this way. So we are, you know, we're doing that work, but it's frustrating.
We learn with every one of these villages, we learn something and we do something different. While I think it's really important that we look back and we say, what were some of the roadblocks that occurred? Because we've been doing this so long, we've figured out how to get around them. So we start with, what do we need to do so that we don't end up in the situation?
An ordinance that actually predated the other one, but it allows for religious and faith sponsors to host some of these encampments with fewer restriction. And that was the kind of preceding or the presiding code for that TC Spirit Village, and really actually is the part of the reason that our relationship with faith partners, not only for community building, not only for construction, not only for volunteerism, but why that actually became codified too, is that under federal law, there is you have to allow faith institutions to practice the religious act, which it is a protected act, of providing sanctuary. And so that code is very long-standing, and leads us into a lot of partnerships with faith groups in order to move through these bureaucratic barriers.
Were the churches part of that that change in policy around getting more lax regulations?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. So on that original back in 2014, that the faith community was part of that task force. And I will say that in getting the ordinance changed in 2019, we changed the ordinance. The faith community played a huge role in that.
The church we already do a lot of community work. We already, working, with construction, because that was my field anyway, was construction. And so I was always working with construction companies, apprenticeship programs. And so with that background with my church, it was a smooth transition because we always worked in the community, and this was a good fit because of we ministered to those in Union Gospel Mission, those on the streets, those in prison, those that are coming out of rehab, and that fit the population that we're working with the tiny houses as well. And so it didn't take a lot of coercion to Traven, but to other churches that I wanted to bring in and share with. It was a little at the beginning, but the more and more notoriety around tiny houses, the more they heard on the news and saw what a few of us as pastors were doing, more and more pastors came on. And that's why I believe now, even more, because of this crisis around Corona and how it's affecting the church, I believe more and more churches will come on board. Now, churches looking at how they can do it and share their property and invest in it to, for it to move forward. So I believe it's a real bright future with churches and community jumping on board. And then what we've learned around having community meetings at churches in different places, that they're feeling more comfortable that to come on board with it, because church is real kind of territorial in a way. We have our structures, our rules, our laws that we have to go by spiritually. But I believe how LIHI lined up with the churches and how the churches that are involved have lined up in the community, it's working out a whole lot better now. And I believe more churches will come on board with property.
Regarding community engagement in the faith community member, our first faith community member, Pastor Marilyn, discovered was to pull in other faith communities in Magnolia. She started talking to the pastors of all of the churches in Magnolia, and then over to Queen Anne also. And she said, we never used to talk. We never used to meet regularly to talk about anything. And they now have developed an ecumenical council for Magnolia and Queen Anne that meets regularly and has several offshoots that provide meals on a rotating basis. It meant so much to her to have outreach to other pastors, to talk to them regularly. And she thought that was just such a wonderful offshoot of this process that she thinks would not have happened had it not been for Tent City and Enter Bay.
That engagement wouldn't have happened if we didn't have the relationship that had been built from the city's perspective through TC Spirit.
Wow.
Right? Like that's how deep this goes, with the city having this opportunity to engage in the community with the community in a different way.
I appreciate the city's seeing how the community is coming together and being able to be a hand. I look at it being a hand up, not a hand out, when we get the support from the city, and now with other funds coming through community, we want to be able to be self-sufficient, do entrepreneurship and other things that we can create out of these partnerships to help those individuals that are in the tiny houses.
The faith community is no one community too, right? It's a compilation of many different communities. And so a faith community that's in a certain part of Seattle may really be focused on fulfilling their mission and on finding themselves in successful service to their neighbors that are homeless, to their community, perhaps to congregants as well that are having that experience. Some of these community partners, I think, really do hold us accountable to how we hold a both and approach, that it's not enough just to be building temporary shelter. And it's not enough just to build affordable housing. It's years away. We have to do both. And again, I just want to highlight like the experience of those faith communities, both in their generosity and in the level of need that we've put on them from a geographical, from a redlining, from a gentrification standpoint. I think really just points to an incredible lift that community is doing, and to just to the level of partnership and that their buy-in to supporting tiny house villages in a short term, and their accountability to making sure that affordable housing is on the horizon for people that are getting pushed out. I think it's just a really key example, and partners like Reverend Willis, Reverend Seals, and others are incredibly critical for that reason too.
How are people's perception of affordable housing or providing housing for our most vulnerable neighbors? How is that changing, maybe because of the tiny home program?
I love Janis's comment about like helping to kind of like not necessarily like educate communities, but prime communities. I would say that on a very specific level, a tiny house village as a crisis response can activate a piece of property, especially a property that's been vacant for a very long time, can show people that it can break down stereotypes and myths about who low-income people are, and it can help diffuse a situation where neighbors are very controlling and feel like a property, if something's going to be done with it, it's not going to be done in partnership, it's not going to be done in collaboration. And just by going through a collaborative process and showing people that a property can be used safely, I think does prime a property to eventually have something permanent, and for people to be on board with that and to support it. On a much higher level, I absolutely think that the conversation on tiny houses has shifted the like citywide consciousness around the need and the importance and really the acceptability of affordable housing. I don't have a like survey data to show that public opinion has changed around affordable housing in neighborhoods. I think that'd be really interesting. Is do people agree more blanket statement with affordable housing? Well, how do people feel about affordable housing nearby? Has that shifted at all? That'd be a great bit of information to get. But I definitely think the conversation has shifted. I see more openness. I see, everybody that shows up. Granted, we're sampling a very select group of people. If we want to be involved, almost everybody I talk to is in support of doing affordable housing. Again, but like those, it's the nuanced details, right? It's on a project level. It's like, is this property okay? Who are the neighbors right there? The bigger conversation will lay the framework for funding. The smaller conversations will lay the framework for a successful project, is my framing.
No, yeah, I love that. That was well said. Janis, when you speak to neighbors and folks in the community, how is that perception changing?
The tiny houses are very well received in Magnolia, and I would like to point out, if you don't know the city well, the tiny house community is sort of at the base of the Magnolia Bridge, so it's not really in the neighborhood. People who live in Magnolia, which is a fairly, I'm overgeneralizing, but it's a fairly upper middle class, single family home community with, on the east side, condos and apartment buildings and some lower income housing. But for the most part, there are some magnificent views, wealthy people who really don't like going to a park and seeing a tent. So the knowledge that there are these villages that are neat and clean and have flowers out front and little porches makes it much more acceptable as a way that our tax dollars be spent. And I think that there wouldn't be, and I'm speaking for the community, not for myself personally. I think that they should be everywhere. I think it also adds the benefit of when the tiny houses are built, it can be a community project. I mean, I know neighbors, my husband went down and did some painting or putting linoleum on the floors. You know, we bought one of the tiny houses that's down there now, and to get it really draws in the community to do stuff. We've had some, from the beginning, some absolute heroes in our community. The guy who owns the local Ace Hardware store is an angel. You know, before they hooked up electricity, he brought everyone flashlights. You know, he was like Santa Claus. He'd just go out there and like, what do you need? You need gravel. I'm going to have it delivered. And it's been a pleasure. I think people are willing to participate and donate, and it's not directly in the middle of the village.
Is the jury still out of whether or not there's, it's like, is the feeling like the box has been checked, or if there's a feeling of like sort of a growth mindset of like, what else can we do?
I think it's both. We are one earthquake away from being homeless. We are, you know, one COVID pandemic. We are one medical emergency from losing everything. So the notion that there's any kind of comfort in this world is kind of crazy. A lot of these were your Magnolia neighbors who found themselves homeless. From the community point of view is, you know, we support people being taken care of. You know, we think our tax money is paying for it. We want it used effectively. So just more action, treating it like it's an emergency, because it's going to be a bigger emergency very, very soon with COVID and unemployment.
When I think about the different stages of, you know, building these tiny home communities, and you think of the site and the funding and the operations, you know, usually it seems like one party is in charge of a certain aspect, like site selection or whatever else, but it seems like each stakeholder, at least on this call, has already been in part of the site selection process. Whether it's like, hey, why are you checking out that federal land, or a church offering up a property, or LIHI that has a site in pre-development, or the city owning land. And then from the funding aspect, it seems like that also comes from a range of sources, whether it's the community putting up some funds for operations, or the city covering it with their general fund. So it seems like every stage of this does have a lot of different involvement from stakeholders, which really is like a sign of how just grassroots rather than top-down this is, which is really interesting to see kind of the differences to other cities. Maybe each of you can just provide 2 tips of advice for a city or community of what to keep in mind, be aware of, or what they should do if they're looking at doing some kind of transitional housing program in their own city.
My number one, in short form, is that cities have the opportunity in setting these villages up to create partnerships with groups that usually don't have a way to contribute into these problems. And so don't miss the opportunity. It's probably very attractive to buy a village and to put it down somewhere. And that's the easy thing. And it might even be the fastest way to fulfill a campaign promise. But don't deny your community all of its different facets, a way to get involved. The second piece, management. And I would love to, it's a great conversation to have, because a village is just a space. These are just 2x4 framed houses. There's nothing magical about them. And while the community is a really critical part of this, I think that anyone who's doing any kind of development of a village really needs to think about how they can operate in an equitable way, how they can operate in a safe way, how they can center the needs of the people that are most vulnerable, how they can function with racial equity in mind, all these different things. So I think management's huge. Find local service providers that are good at what they do and love what they do. People that have lived experience are often incredible staff people, because it's not like just a hardware versus software issue. It's like a love and heart and community, and it's like it's what they live and breathe and want to do, is support people that are in maybe a situation that they've been in. And so that's super important, right? We're talking about communities of people.
Yeah, I would just second everything Brad said. Brad really summed up a lot of what I was going to say, which I think is indicative to how important it is for policymakers to work on these projects in partnership and not as the controller. We were put in a situation where early in this project, we were very often in community meetings standing together, and that was really important. Just from our perspective, just getting out of the way of the community and letting the community do their thing, which is different, I think, from other cities that have done these type of projects where it has been really, and Brad, you did a great job of sort of describing how some of those other projects are very city driven policy, like we're going to do this through this model where, ours is more organic, I think. And I think the other piece that I would want to wrap up with is Janis is one of many community members who through this project have become part of this movement, right? So we have 8 community advisory committees throughout the city made up of people from the community. So don't underestimate that piece of the community engagement through the advisory committees, and because that is invaluable for policymakers.
I think that from the city level, you should be more ambitious, more bold, think outside the box. Other thing, which will fit in a tweet, is robust on-site case management, effective case management. That makes such a difference.
The community, having community and organizations meet in the community, and when they engage, it looks like it's a holistic approach from city, community, and organization talking on neutral ground, and it's not seeing like it's being dictated by one or the other, but it's total buy-in as we come together. Because I think that was one of the most important things, is getting the buy-in of the people and them trusting the process. Just transparency, talking in the community with all organizations, being a part of it at a neutral place.
I really appreciate everyone's time in providing the candid insight into the process that's worked in Seattle. So, with that, Lisa and Janis and Bradford and Pastor Lawrence Willis, thank you so much for joining us on this roundtable and allowing us to take a deep dive into Seattle's tiny home program.
All right, blessed, and I thank you for allowing us to come together.